It's a real pleasure to be here to speak with you all. I'm Isaac. I'm assistant professor of early Christianity at UBC. I'm an Asian Canadian man with dark brown hair, translucent circular glasses, and a beard. My pronouns are he, him. I'm speaking to you today in Canada from the unceded territories of the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq peoples. And I want to thank Bill Gaventa and the folks at the Faith Inclusion Network, especially Tom Jones, for the warm invitation to participate in this conference with you and to share a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing over the past decade. So the contours of my research center really on embodiment in the ancient Mediterranean, with a focus on early Christian and Jewish and Greek and Roman material. And as just mentioned, my work has focused on intersections between disability and gender and enslavement, particularly in wider, as they are embedded in wider cultures of healthcare, medicine, and ideal embodiment. I've also written a little bit on short-statured figures in the New Testament, each of which interrogates scholarly preconceptions about the bodies and abilities of early Christian figures. And this is kind of the focus of my most recent project, which I've sent off a book manuscript a couple months ago to a publisher, fingers crossed, on ancient Christian figures like Mary, John the Baptist, on Jesus of Nazareth, and Judas, who I argue actually in various Christian portrayals in literature are actually portrayed as being very far from normate than we might realize. And these figures, I argue, actually break widely held conceptions that early Christians expected key figures in their movement to have, quote unquote, normal bodies. And in this work, I challenge the idea that there is a kind of normal, quote unquote, Christian body that even exists for normative figures, even like Jesus. Today, I'm really here. I've been asked to speak to you about my first book-length project published with Oxford University Press in 2023 called A Disabled Apostle, Impairment and Disability in the Letters of Paul. On the slide is an image of my book cover, which it's a portrait of Paul's face, which I drew myself based on many of the details we find in early Christian sources. He has got a kind of a pointed beard, a monobrow, an aquiline nose, and he's bald. My lecture today is divided into 6 parts. In the first part, I will explain some of the background to the project to situate the work within my research, as well as the streams of disability biblical scholarship, which many of you are no doubt already well aware. In the second part, I'll talk briefly about the method and approach I use to analyze disability in the ancient world, defining disability and tracing its presence in the ancient world with the limited knowledge we have can be a very haphazard affair. And I outline some of the scholarship and definitions I use to help me come to my final conclusions in the book. In the third, fourth, and fifth parts of today's lecture, I'll briefly talk through my arguments for the kinds of disabilities I recognize Paul to have had. One, which is demonic habitation, the so-called thorn in the flesh. I'm sure there are lots of questions about this, and I'd be happy to field some of them if you have them in our Q&A time, or afterwards if you would like to email me, very happy to correspond. So one that I will be talking about briefly is demonic habitation, or is thorn in the flesh. Another will be circumcision in the ancient Mediterranean environment. And finally, short stature. In each of these sections, I'll talk about the evidence that we have that explicitly connects Paul to these conditions. I'm going to talk about the wider Mediterranean receptions of these bodily conditions. So not just how they're characterized, but how they're viewed. I'm going to talk briefly about their use of these conditions in Paul's letters, how he specifically uses them and how he deploys them in his rhetorical work. And then finally, I'm going to think about the implications for our understanding of Paul himself. Finally, in the 6th and final section of the lecture today, and hopefully we'll get to it, hopefully I won't waffle on here too long, I'll discuss some of the implications of the book in dialogue with some of the wonderful feedback and critique that I've received from fellow scholars in the field. And like I said, we might have a little bit of time for questions, but if there's anything that I haven't answered and something you want to press me on, please feel free to reach out to me via email at isaac.soon, SOON, at ubc.ca. And I'd really be happy to correspond with you. So we turn first to the background to this book. This book originally began with a master's thesis at the University of Oxford in 2015. I was originally interested in studying Paul's physical appearance. What did he look like, and how do we know? Paul, as a figure, especially in religious communities, is often referred to and thought about in the abstract. The phrase I like to use, and something I've used since my time as a graduate student, is that we sometimes think about Paul as a kind of floating theological brain traveling around the Mediterranean, preaching and ministering in different communities. And it was a very surprising revelation for me for it to dawn that actually, yes, Paul did have a body, very simply. And perhaps if we knew something about his body and how it worked and what it looked like, we'd be able to think about how his embodied experiences might affect our understanding of his letters. At the core of this was a desire for me not just to excavate Paul for ideas, but to also to understand him as a fully embodied person, and how the movement which he cultivates and nurtures is not only a movement of theological ideas, but it's also a movement of theological living and embodiment. Like any budding graduate student, I bit off far more than I could chew, and I ambitiously planned 10 whole chapters of work, to the horror of my supervisor, from about Paul, from his claimed emaciation. He talks about going hungry, going without food. I had a section thinking about his occasional lack of clothing, his excessive travel, imprisonments, all the way through to very famous passages like we'll deal with today in 2 Corinthians 12, which is his thorn in the flesh, and his weakness of the flesh in Galatians 4, 13 to 15. And of course, the probably the most well-known, which is his temporary visual impairment as depicted in Acts 9, 22 and 26. Needless to say, as a master's student, as a graduate student, I was only able to focus on a few of these issues, but it provided a really, really great foundation for when I launched later on into my doctoral work. My book, as published, was the outworking of my doctoral thesis under the supervision of a wonderful scholar and theologian, Jane Heath, over in Durham, just across the pond. For those of you who might be familiar with the early Christian writer Clement of Alexandria, she is a leading expert on his work, one of the most amazingly talented and thoughtful and nuanced scholars. She was the one who really pushed me to consider the implications of thinking about Paul as an embodied person. What about disability? And I had known about disability in biblical studies really only tangentially through the work of Louise Gosbell, whom you will get the pleasure of hearing later today. After reading Louise's work and the work of other scholars like Candida Moss, Megan Henning, Louise Lawrence, really the pillars of disability and biblical studies over the last 20 years. And after falling into the wonderful world of disability history that had been taken up in classics and biblical studies, I realized that really no full-length book on Paul and disability had yet been written up. So I took it upon myself to change this reality. The reason for this, there had been many articles that had been written and speculations that have been written. One great article, if you're looking for resources, by Adela Yarbrough Collins, a chapter on Paul's disability. But for a lot of scholars, they had really given up on whether we can think about Paul's disability from a very specific angle because of skepticism towards diagnosing in the past. And so the issue of for a lot of scholars, it was, well, Paul was possibly ill, possibly had a disability, but we really can't know what it was. And so this was the kind of challenge that I wanted to take on.
1 second, Dr. Soon. This is the tech team in the back here.
Sure.
If you're able to share your presentation on your computer.
Oh, sure. I was sharing it before. Is it not sharing anymore?
It
How's
is
that?
sharing, but it minimized kind of
Oh,
intensely, so folks can't see it super well.
how about
It
now?
looks, there we go. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, we were trying to figure out where you were in our PowerPoint and do it
No
on the
worries.
back end, but it would be
No
much better for you to be able to control your PowerPoint. So thank you.
Okay, no worries. Let me know if you have any more issues. Thanks. I appreciate that, team. So just thinking a little bit about method and approach. The approach that I use in this book is fundamental to understanding how I come to my conclusions, especially identifying facets of the ancient world, such as circumcision, which we might not normally think as a disability in an ancient context. And I would really want to stress here at the beginning that my approach is applied to understanding the dynamics of disability in the ancient world, not as a tool for not as a diagnostic for identifying what could or should be considered a disability today. And I'm particularly sensitive to this, especially in relation to circumcision, because I know that is a practice that's debated in some circles, and a cursory reading of my work might suggest to some that it should be used kind of to defend so-called kind of intactivist rhetoric. In my opinion, I think the opposite is the case. My work here is not meant to be prescriptive. It's not meant to establish normativity. It's meant to help us think about conditions that are disabling in different contexts and conditions that we might not normally consider disabilities. Of course, it's a well-worn phrase, retro-diagnosing or diagnosing conditions, physical conditions in the ancient world is impossible simply because we have incomplete historical archives. Diagnosing conditions today with all of the medical tools that we have can be difficult in itself. How much more when we're trying to peer into the past, into people's lives when we don't have direct access to them, and with limited historical archives. And even if we had exhaustive historical data, disability activism, a critical theory, has over the past century, of course, pushed back against merely reducing disability to biomedical conditions, especially using medical taxonomies today, so the medical model of disability. The surety of medical taxonomy has really in the past lulled ancient scholarship in both classics and in early Christianity into a kind of false sense of security about the universality of human embodiment and embodied experience. There is so much the medical sciences have taught us, and yet the differences between modern and ancient conceptions of ability and disability, of ideal bodies, can sometimes be as stark as day and night. And it is not, and I'm not saying it's not that diagnosis is inherently bad. For example, the ability to diagnose a fertility condition that's detailed on an ancient a healing epigraph or something from an ancient healing temple. It's not that diagnosing is inherently bad. What disability critics eschew in historical diagnosis is because it narrowly defines disabled experiences. It's really reductive. At the same time, however, an overemphasis on diagnosis obscures culturally relative bodily ideals about fertility or pregnancy or treatment or other conditions. Recently, for me, I've been investigating the ancient area of paradoxography, basically collections of ancient folk tales akin to Ridley's Believe It or Not. Paradoxographies are relatively understudied and often ignored in classics and early Christian scholarship. They're mostly maligned by medical historians because they seem so inherently irrational from a disenchanted and medicalized Anthropocene. But they serve as useful points of comparison for ancient conceptions of any kind of embodiment and can actually help us conceptualize ancient bodily ideals and expectations, especially those that depart from our own entrenched medicalized taxonomies of human embodiment. So what I'm saying is, to get to understand physical conditions in the past, it's not merely about thinking about conditions in taxonomies we have today, like visual impairments or mobility impairments, because those taxonomies are based on bodily ideals established by the biomedical sciences. But in ancient cultures, in various cultures, their ideals are different. They're not necessarily the same from culture to culture. And so for us to investigate conditions in the ancient past, we have to understand what their bodily ideals are first. And in doing so, we're able to uncover the bodies and the functions and the embodiments, which are marginalized or differentiated, and in many cases oppressed or stigmatized. And that's when we can see the dynamics of disability outside of kind of our own medicalized frameworks. Because disability is defined over against bodily ideals and conditions considered normate, I decided in my book to look at conditions that may not be classified as typical disabilities today, for example, mobility impairment or visual impairment or neurodiversity, things like that. I drew particularly on the work of Anne Waldschmidt, who combines facets of social and cultural models of disability. So on the slide is an image of Dr. Waldschmidt. She's a white woman with short curled brown hair, smiling, wearing a gray blazer. And drawing on Waldschmidt, I define impairment and disability in my book with the following. So impairment is a bodily condition that is functionally and or aesthetically differentiated from a socially constructed bodily ideal. So we have an ideal, and then we have a body which is functionally or aesthetically differentiated from that ideal. Disability, as I define in the book, is an impairment that generates negative effects in its social and cultural environment. As impairment depends on a socially constructed ideal, so too does disability rely on an environment's unfavorable reaction to an impairment. The mere fact that something might be considered an impairment does not automatically mean that it causes discrimination or should be considered a disability. And here I'm particularly drawing on the work of Louise Gosbell, but also Rebecca Raphael. So to speak of Paul as a disabled apostle is to say that he participates in and experiences disability as his impairments interact negatively with the society and culture around him. The key to Waldschmidt's method and approach to disability is that she argues that there are denormalization processes. These are processes that show when particular conditions, impairments, are being culturally differentiated from normate bodies. So in my book on Paul, I focus on 6 particular processes: prosthesis, stigma, liminality, which is a kind of placing in between 2 degrees out of a spectrum, exclusion, stereotyping, ridicule, and violence. This is not exhaustive, but these were selected because of their relevance to the physical issues that I address in the book itself. Of course, the question of which Paul I'm talking about is relevant to our discussion. My book focuses on Paul as depicted in the undisputed letters, that is, the letters of Paul, which many, but certainly not all, New Testament scholars argue undisputedly were penned by the historical Paul himself. I do not coordinate much evidence from the Acts of the Apostles, as it's not clear to me the author of Acts did in fact know Paul personally. If you want to fight about that, we can do that in the Q&A, even while they might have had a knowledge of some of Paul's letters. So that's why I use these ones. Also, finite limitations. I can only write so much, and the larger amount of Paul's letters I use, the less space I have to discuss and go into depth. I do want to note at the end of this, I know there's a lot of throat clearing here, so we're getting beyond the prolegomena. I do want to note that had I written this book today, the methodology and engagement with contemporary disability theory and other critical biblical scholarship would be very different. Unfortunately for me, my awareness of the expanding work on disability, especially as it relates to crip theory and transfeminism, at the time was really limited. And my excuse, and I think it's a marginally legitimate one, is that as a graduate student, there's just only so many times almost time in a day to read. Of course, the ability to look back, having finished the book and having matured in my own scholarship, has changed my perspective on the project. And even if I were aware of other streams of disability theory and theology that I'm now familiar with today, I'm not sure I would have been in the right place necessarily to be able to understand it at an earlier time. And I think in a way, this is appropriate in the study of disability, since living with disability, understanding it in the past, and studying disability is closely bound up with provisional knowledge. If reflection on epistemology or knowledge shows us anything, it's that we're always in the process of knowing in a new way. On the other hand, I recognize that the approach I use in this book is not perfect. It's not meant to be. I have no delusions that what I argue and put forward in this book will be timeless, like an unchangeable monument. And I really hope, that's my biggest hope, is that it's a useful starting point for other scholars to take up and improve upon my work. So, to the meat and bones, we turn to the first disability which I discuss in my book, which is Paul's thorn in the flesh. So on the slide, there is an excerpt from 2 Corinthians, so his 2nd Corinthian letter, chapter 12, verses 7 to 10. And in the background, there's a picture of a set of thorns. So Paul says this. He says, therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated. And that repetition there is not a typo. This is actually in the text. 3 times I appealed to the Lord, so the God of Israel, about this, that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. Paul was disabled in more ways than one, and in my book, I argue that we can know of 3. The first disability was, I argue, a demonic force, the thorn in the flesh, which prevented him from speaking about apocalyptic sights and sounds that he experienced in the 3rd heaven. In 2 Corinthians 12, the beginning part of this chapter, Paul details his own visionary or mantic journey through the heavens. And during that time, the text says that he was given a thorn in the flesh, an angel of Satan, to beat him or pummel him. The language here is very, very violent. The history of interpreting this one condition is too vast to detail in this lecture. Suffice to say that every condition from malaria to sexual lasciviousness has been put forward. And if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer to the best of my memory. What interpreters have not often paid attention to, however, is that specific phrase, the angel of Satan language, often thinking that it's metaphorical. In the ancient world, ancient Christian readers would not have viewed this in the same kind of post-Enlightenment rationalistic way, for example, as a metaphor for mental illness, but as a real cosmic or transmundane, to use the language of Annette Reed, a transmundane force that affected Paul's body. Spirits, angels, demons, ancient Christian interpreters lived in an enchanted world where external malevolent forces could oppress and sometimes even inhabit people's bodies, causing pain and illness, and sometimes physical and mental disability. There's a connection there, at least for them. Across ancient Jewish and Christian cultures, having external forces invade your body to set up shop and take total control was stigmatized. There were prayers, incantations, bowls, remedies, magic rings. Many methods were used to return the body to an unaltered state where spiritual forces no longer held sway over one's body. So we get a sense here of the ideal, which is to ideal body, which is to be spirit free or to not have any kind of possessing spirit. And then the condition, the differentiated condition where there are people who have bodies invaded by spirits, and then the tools, the processes of denormalization, which try to move one body into that ideal state. In my book, I argue the simplest understanding of Paul's thorn in 2 Corinthians is that it is an angel of Satan, sent by God to prevent Paul from revealing divine revelations that he's seen and heard. The context of the argument is that these are things that Paul can boast about, but he's not going to boast about it. In fact, that would be counterintuitive to his message. So he's bringing up an episode of something, well, actually, I've been up to these higher places. I've had these visionary experiences. I've seen and heard divine revelations that I'm not allowed to share. That's how important of an apostle I am. And that's the kind of wider context, literary context of Paul's thorn. What's interesting about this angel of Satan is that it inhabits his body and cohabits with the Holy Spirit, and it perfects the power within him, right? So Paul begs God to remove it from his body, and God says no. He's asked 3 times, says no, and actually says, the power is actually perfected with weakness. And so I argue in this book that Paul has 2 spirits within him. He has the Holy Spirit, but he also has this angel of Satan, which is also, and it's a chronic condition. It's been there for 14 years. The treatment of those who are demonized and the variety of methods used by ancient Jews to protect their bodies from malevolent spirits or to evict them from the flesh, these show that Paul's demonization would have been considered a disability, or at least we can consider it a disability from their perspective. Rather than trying to rationalize why the God of Israel gives him the thorn or does not allow it to leave his body, Paul instead refers to a mystery or paradox, that what humans view as weakness from a divine perspective is in fact strength. My grace is sufficient for you. Power is made perfect in weakness. This is actually central, and this is kind of a tangent. This is central to Paul's message about Jesus, because this crucified Messiah is precisely the antithesis of widely held divine strength in the ancient Mediterranean. In other words, his own experience with the thorn in the flesh affirms and mirrors the life and scandal of Jesus of Nazareth. So far as I know, we do not have ancient visual culture relatively close to the time of Paul that depicts demonic habitation or possession. This is a kind of unseen force that makes sense. And I was lucky that our archive is rich with other material, incantations, narratives, amulets concerning demonic affliction and its malcontents. So I could still show the stigmatization of those whose bodies were affected by angelic invasion. Still, this reveals a kind of limitation of the sociocultural model that I use in this book. Because this model depends on existing culture for comparison, in the absence of that culture, whether it's because of accessibility or because of limitations of archive, the things that have survived, it might not be possible to understand some conditions as disabilities or impairments in their ancient social contexts, even ones that we might consider to be disabilities today. So this gestures to the reality that the method I employ in the book is kind of one limited way to understand disability in the ancient world. And it relies heavily on existing comparative evidence. And really points to the fact that there should be other approaches nurtured and developed that help capture disabled embodiments and experiences in previously unimagined ways that rely less on kind of the serendipity of available evidence. One of the questions that is raised with the conclusions of my book, so Paul has this thorn, it's affecting his speech. Is this thorn a device for punishment? Is it something that, or is it something that actually alters his speech? Is it a speech disfluency or a stutter? And this is a question that my own doctoral supervisor, Jane Heath, and my examiners, John Barclay and Louise Lawrence, they pressed on me. I tried to avoid the question, but they pressed it on me. On the one hand, I think, we don't have enough information in the text of 2 Corinthians to say for sure. That's a cop-out, but that's one way of thinking about it. But on the other hand, the overlap between demonic activity and perceived illness makes it difficult to separate what we think of as a physical condition with demonic habitation or demonic possession. I do think, though, that the idea that Paul might have some kind of speech disfluency is possible. So I'm not ruling it out, even though the evidence, we don't have enough evidence to talk about it in the text, like as a slam dunk. I think there is a possibility. So in 2 Corinthians, a couple chapters before Paul mentions the thorn, one of the criticisms raised by the community about him is that he has poor bodily presence and he's a terrible public speaker. They're complaining. They're saying, when this guy comes to town, he's hard to listen to, but when he writes his letters, he's extremely angry. So what's going on? And we have to think about this in the context of wider Corinth. Corinth is like the cultural New York of the ancient Mediterranean. You have sophists and philosophers and public speakers who are experts at the minutia of gestures and their rhetorical effects on an audience. So it's within this wider kind of super able-bodied public speaking context where Paul, as a kind of lowly itinerant preacher who's preaching this enslaved Jewish crucified Messiah, he's contrasted with these other abilities. A couple years ago, I think in 2021, there was a great scholar, Richard Last, actually published an article arguing that Paul talked about his own speech disfluency. And I really wish I had known about that before I finished my book, because I think that there is a plausible connection there. There might be a follow-up article or follow-up work for someone to work on that. Another question that's raised about this particular disability with Paul's thorn, does it matter for shaping what he says or what he can express? And I think the answer is yes. I think it does shape Paul's message. He's in 2 Corinthians, he's recounting a message, something he's received and he's had chronically for 14 years. And 2 Corinthians is near, if our timelines are correct, it's near to the end of his ministry before he's executed. So this is the expanse of his ministry. So on the one hand, it does limit what he can say about his divine journeys, about his kind of visionary journeys across the heavens. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, about the idea of mystery and paradox, his disabled speech through the thorn actually shapes the motif of strength and weakness. In other words, the core message, the core paradox of Paul's message is disabled speech. And this is kind of what I'm straining to reach for in the conclusion of the book, that Paul's message is deeply informed by and shaped by disability. And the corollary that follows is that disability is not peripheral or ancillary to early Christianity, but actually central to it. Early Christianity, or at least Pauline versions of Christianity, is made possible by Paul's disabled speech. Another question that's raised is, will Paul's thorn remain in resurrection? So in another part of the book, when I talk about circumcision, and I'm going to briefly mention this in a moment, I talk about how Jews in the ancient world would likely, if they believed in resurrection, would have anticipated circumcision to be something that lasts through to resurrection, to the age to come. But the question was posed unto me, well, will this thorn remain in resurrection too? If we conceive of it primarily as a speech disfluency, I think it's perfectly possible for Paul to conceive a future where this remains as part of his person. If we think of it primarily through the angel of Satan from a demonic point of view, I'm less sure, especially given conceptions about demons as potentially conveying impurity. This actually presents problems of holiness and theodicy for Paul in a future age where holiness and kind of being on the margins are not theoretically and theologically supposed to coexist. I leave that for someone who's more theologically erudite than me. At the same time, if we suppose Paul's transformed speech, because of the thorn remains in his resurrection, I wonder too a little bit about the place of prophecy and revealed knowledge in this future age. Will knowledge be accessible to all? And if so, will prophecy be necessary when believers view God with unveiled faces? That's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3. That's how kind of he expresses that future age. Or to put it another way, will it be necessary for any prophet to speak in the age to come? Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13:9 that in the present believers know and prophesy in part, but in the future when perfection comes, prophecy will cease. So perhaps then Paul's transformed speech doesn't remain, or maybe it does remain, but is kind of masked by the eternal silence of replete divine knowledge. You don't need to speak because you already know. So that's the thorn in the flesh. Let's move briefly to think about circumcision. So on the slide here is an excerpt from Paul's letter to Philippi in Macedonia, Philippians 3:4-6. On the side, there's an image of a mosaic from the house of the evil eye. On the mosaic is a short-statured person. He's playing some flutes. And on to the side of him, you can't really see it because I've cut it off, but there are other animals, including leopards and birds. Not pictured are scorpions, and there's a trident and a dog, and they're all surrounding an evil eye and attacking it. So the second disability that I talk about in my book that Paul experienced was circumcision. We know Paul was circumcised not only because he was Jewish, not all Jewish men in the ancient world necessarily practiced circumcision, but because he explicitly talks about it in Philippians 3. He talks about his 8th-day circumcision, righteous according to the command in Genesis 17, and how it's a part of a host of other qualities he can brag about, but which he restrains from doing in order to boast in Christ. This is Paul's equivalent of a humble brag. He's bragging, but not actually bragging. So he's not using it in this particular instance. So while circumcision was a covenantal seal of pride for ancient Jewish men, circumcision in the wider Greek and Roman world was viewed as a mutilation, a kind of monstrous and oftentimes hypersexualized physical feature of uncivilized or barbarian bodies, quote unquote. And I want to stress here that I'm outlining ancient Mediterranean perspectives. I'm not saying that this is how circumcision should be viewed today. This kind of rhetoric has been used in contemporary discourses for not only to vilify circumcision in Jewish communities, but also in Middle Eastern communities or communities that practice Islam, but in a number of different areas. So I really want to make sure we're very clear about that. The reason why circumcision was vilified is because ancient Greek and Roman men were particularly careful about revealing the penile glands of male members because the exposure of the glands was often used in hypersexualized and apotropaic contexts, or contexts of dispelling magic. It was something that made people stare, they laughed, and it was a powerful image that could dispel invidia or envy, or as the kids like to say today, bad vibes. But it was also used in ethnic invective, and especially triangulated towards North African, Egyptian, and Jewish cultures. But it was Jewish men who were typically stereotyped through circumcision. The cultural norm across the Mediterranean was foreskin, having it, preserving it, keeping it. There's no need to incise it off. And anything that departed from that was marginalized and stigmatized. At some point in Jewish history, we see really actually the very vivid and violent animosity towards the practice. For example, in the Seleucid outlawing of Jewish Torah observance in the 2nd century, at least according to Maccabean texts, parents who decided to circumcise their children in secret were actually forced to bear their kind of murdered children around their necks. So it's not kind of just a theoretical or rhetorical view of Jewish practices, but sometimes part of actually a deep-seated prejudice and disgust towards such bodily conditions. If you're familiar with Paul, you know, strangely and weirdly, Paul divides believers, followers of Jesus, into two ethnicities, Jews and non-Jews. And he calls Jewish Christ followers the circumcision, and he calls non-Jewish Christ followers the foreskin. This is a little bit of a weird ecclesial practice, but he divides the world into these two groups for him. But even though he himself is Jewish, he doesn't always portray circumcision in a positive light here. The value for Paul of circumcision depends on the ethnicity of the person who has it. So on the one hand, he emphasizes the appropriateness of circumcision on Jewish men, but that it is a mutilation on non-Jewish bodies. So there's two standards here. It's absolutely appropriate and applicable for a Jewish man to circumcise, but for non-Jews, especially non-Jews who are not converting to Judaism, but who are starting to follow Jesus, this is not something that should be done. The reason is because Paul says circumcision on non-Jewish bodies, on Gentile bodies, has serious Christological implications. Gentiles who circumcise themselves are cut off from Christ. That's Galatians 5. And this is precisely the issue that he's dealing with in Galatians in his letter, a non-Jewish community who is being pressured, and I think by other non-Jews. He's not being pressured by Jewish communities, but they're being pressured by other non-Jews who have maybe taken on this practice to take up circumcision. And Paul says, well, if you do this, you're not only going to cut yourself from Christ, but it's going to make it very difficult for you actually to return to Christ. And perhaps the solution I suggest in my book is the only solution to overcome this is actually to become eunuchs, so that you're no longer in violation of the Jewish laws concerning circumcision. So what's weird about Paul is he reinforces actually the Mediterranean stigma surrounding circumcision in his letters for non-Jews, while at the same time he tries to retain its importance for Jewish men at the same time. And then in the book, I argue that circumcision, while circumcision was taboo for Gentiles, Paul would probably have expected Jewish men to retain their circumcision in their future spirit resurrected bodies. And so what would be a disability for Greek and Romans in this life will actually be an eternal feature of Jewish bodies for eternity. We move to the last disability of Paul that I explore, short stature. So on the slide are two quotations, one from 2 Corinthians 11, 32 to 33, and another from the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which is an apocryphal early Christian work. And there's also a kind of very blurry, this is the best image I could get because access to the archive is actually restricted at the moment in Libya. But it's an image of a mosaic with a bald and bearded, short-statured man. The wider context is actually the short-statured man, the man possibly with dwarfism, is actually fighting beasts in Roman North Africa. So it's a kind of use of a spectacle of a little person who's being put to work in a violent situation. In 2 Corinthians 11, Paul says, he says this very strange, short, laconic story. In Damascus, the governor under King Aretas guarded the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped from his hands. And then in Acts of Paul and Thecla, in section 3, there's a person who's viewing Paul. He says he saw Paul coming, a small man with regard to height, bald on the head, curved in the legs, healthy, monobrowed to a little degree, an aquiline nose, full of grace. Sometimes he appeared as a man, other times he had the face of an angel. So the final disability that I argue in my book was that Paul had had short stature. Paul's description of his descent down a Damascus city wall in a basket is more than just about his experience as a fugitive. We see this strange episode of him being lowered into a basket. And one day, as I was reading through this passage, I'm fairly sure I had 2 children who were climbing on top of me. So one of them might have kicked me in the head where I had this idea. And I raised this question and I said, well, how small do you have to be to fit into one of these baskets? Or how big is the basket itself? And this section is my most experimental. It's speculative. I'm really trying to think outside the box here. I do not expect everyone to be convinced by it. But I looked into the word that was used for the basket here, and I tried to actually calculate its volume capacity based on remaining archaeological and papyrological evidence. And I calculated the math. We have the name of types of baskets which had volume containing particular types of volume. And if it is, in fact, the basket that Paul says that he was in, it's actually too small to carry an average size human. And by averaged here, I say based on kind of trends in bone data, osteoarchaeological data in ancient Judea. So this might suggest that Paul was shorter than the average person. And this is something we received in early Christian literature, like the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Paul short in stature. And the term short there is not just mikros, the Greek word. It's not just someone who's below average, but sometimes sometimes refers to people who have dwarfism or who are very short statured. So even beyond what might be considered below average. Even his name, the name Paulus in Latin, it's a Roman nickname for short or little. So is this a coincidence? I argue maybe not. Short stature in the ancient Mediterranean departed from the physical ideal of average height. So if you're too tall, people would make fun of you. If you're too short, people would make fun of you. And as such, those with short stature and dwarfism were mocked. They were objectified. So as we saw in the mosaic from the previous slide, in the house of the evil eye, the purpose of putting a person with dwarfism there or short stature is that that person also serves as a kind of combating force to evil eye, bad vibes, kind of invidia, envy. But as this slide shows with the mosaic of the dwarf person with a dwarfism fighting in the arena, fighting beasts, they're also used as boxers and pugilists in lunchtime matinees of spectacles, performing battles. And we think about boxing, we think about very soft gloves. Boxing in the ancient Roman world, you had metal and bone, which were woven into leather straps, which were used for physical violence. So this is not a kind of 11 o'clock Lilo and Stitch movie viewing. This is a very violent situation to put people into. And so I argue in my book, like his use of circumcision, Paul actually capitalizes, I think, on his own short stature, reinforcing the stigma in his letters. And he uses it for his own rhetorical gain. So he talks about being the least or the smallest among all the apostles. He portrays himself as a kind of A short-statured pugilist comically punching himself. He says, I beat my body into submission. And he likens his ministry to kind of being in an arena fighting beasts, a further demonstration that God's strength is exemplified in weakness. In any case, what this part of the book really challenges is preconceived notions about early Christian figures and their bodies. Why must we assume their able-bodiedness? And what's at stake if their bodies are impaired and disabled? Close readers of my book will note how I seem to kind of vacillate between calling Paul short-statured and calling him as someone who lived with a kind of dwarfism. I think in the end, I kind of settled on confidently calling Paul short-statured while being agnostic based on the evidence about whether this constituted dwarfism or not. We just don't know. Yes. So just moving on into summary here. A skeptical reader might demur about whether it's possible that Paul had multiple disabilities at the same time. The reality of disabled folks today, of course, brings a swift corrective. Rarely is the experience of disability tied to a singular condition. Often conditions overlap, compound with one another, sometimes in tandem, and other times in sequence. With Paul, there may be more disabilities to discover, but what we can say at the end of my study, however, is that far from being a kind of marginal subsidiary facet of his life and ministry, I think actually disability has an essential part in the creation and use of Paul's letters, his epistolary communications. Really underlying my book is a critique of a kind of ableism in Pauline studies, and it goes like this. Since Paul was so obviously able in other areas, scholars assume that he was not disabled at all. So one of my colleagues, Lisa Bowens, asks, if Paul was afflicted with a debilitating illness, how could he have accomplished and endured so much? And she's really actually drawing on the work of an earlier scholar, Ernest Best, who expressed it like this, quote, whatever aggrieved Paul, he clearly thinks of it as beginning at the time of his vision or a consequence of it. So Best here is commenting on the thorn in the flesh. It cannot have been something to which he was always subject, for example, persecution or temptation. Equally, it cannot have been a congenital physical illness or handicap like a speech impediment, for that would have always been there. Some physical ailments also seem unlikely because no one who suffered from them could have accomplished Paul's missionary work or endured the sufferings listed in 2 Corinthians 11, end quote. So on the one hand, Best assumes that if Paul had an impairment, it had to be congenital. This kind of betrays a very simplistic understanding of the dynamics of impairment and disability. Of course, not all disability is congenital. Much can be acquired over time because of biological, social, economic, or cultural factors. But on the other hand, the assumption that Paul's ability elsewhere discounts his disability in 2 Corinthians 12 is problematic, as though one cannot be able in one area while being disabled in another. The question that gripped me was, how much of Paul's body has to be disabled in order for him to be considered disabled by scholars? Best conforms Paul to what he considers to be a healthy, able-bodied person. It's not a comparison between Paul and his missionary work, but really Paul and the bodily ideal held by the interpreter. In light of the argument of my book, the idea that Paul's great feats of travel required a fully functioning body, quote unquote, should be laid to rest. Paul could be disabled and accomplish all that he did. In the field of biblical studies, the widespread assumption is that prominent figures of the early Jesus movement were by default able-bodied. For the study of Paul, this manifests as the idea that he only ever acquired impairments through his missionary activity, and that disability could not have been native to his body. Candida Moss shows, for example, that Pauline scholarship often connects Paul's use of scribes to a physical issue that has arisen because of his itinerant activities, whether his visual impairment on the Damascus Road in Acts or a damaging of hands through scribal work. And what underlies these conceptions is the ableist idea that Paul's body is by default normal, and it's only later through his missionary work that he acquires disability. My book, I think, unlocks the potential futures for perceiving and uncovering sociocultural disabilities for other early Christian leaders and protagonists. At its heart, his trajectory is shared by the work of Sharon Snyder, David Mitchell's use of what they call biographical criticism and the desire to recover disabled figures in history and literature. This task does not only contribute to contemporary issues surrounding cultural justice and representation, both very important. In other words, that when we recover marginalized identities of influential early Christian figures, it affects folks who are marginalized in religious communities today. This task also reinforces just how central embodiment and disability is to Christian history and to biblical studies. It's not peripheral, but is epistemologically central. This book also draws attention to the kind of protectionism that can occur around disabled figures and founders in Western contexts, and how, drawing on the work of Rosemary Garland Thompson, when bodies don't behave, this misfitting reveals predilections towards able embodiment. For example, my recent article on Jesus of Nazareth as a short Messiah. I know what you're thinking. This guy thinks that everyone is short, and not everyone, just only a few. But the article happened to be picked up by an influencer on TikTok and garnered thousands, and I mean thousands of people commenting and fighting with one another over whether Jesus could have been #a short King of Kings. For some, the perceived divinity and perfection of Jesus was clearly antithetical to the idea that he might have had below average height. Now, the point of all this is not to be controversial or subversive or sensational. I actually expected these visceral responses. The importance of recovering the disabilities and various embodiments of ancient figures and founders is not only for the sake of historical accuracy and plausibility, but also to uncover the deeply ingrained, learned bodily ideals and deeply rooted ableism in every human culture. This outcry against Jesus's possible short height is precisely Garland Thompson's notion of misfitting manifesting in today's culture. What would happen if we let the bodies of ancient figures like Jesus or Paul or Mary or Thecla misbehave? Some of my colleagues, and I'm wrapping up here, sorry. Some of my colleagues in the field, like Louise Lawrence, have in dialogue with my work raised the importance of thinking about labor practices and the embodiment of early Christian figures, like Paul's leatherwork and Peter's fishing trade. Disability, as it has been approached in the New Testament, is often narrowly conceived as congenital, but what happens when we think more acutely of acquired disabilities through socioeconomic circumstances, disordered eating, labor practices, childcare, PTSD, corporal punishment, and most particularly enslavement? What other disabled founders and figures have we been ignoring when we focus only on congenital or typically taxonomized impairments? A frequent refrain among ancient historians regarding disability in the ancient world is the idea that there are many obstacles that obscure us from retrieving autobiographical information from disabled persons in history. We don't have firsthand accounts of disabled persons in ancient societies. It's such a frequent thing that I hear. And that my own work on Paul might be one of the only autobiographical perspectives on living with disability in antiquity. At the risk of being too iconoclastic, I'm not so sure about this narrative as it has been repeated. Disability is quotidian, widespread, and inevitable part of human embodiment. Should we presume its hiddenness, its secretness, its obscurity in our sources? What if it is very much in front of us in our sources, but we do not know it for what it is? I think my book shows conditions that are fairly conspicuous in Paul's letters: circumcision, demonic habitation, and maybe to a lesser degree, short stature. But these are not obscured or hidden or secret. What obscures are our own notions about discourses of disability or our own dogmatic diagnostic categories. Neither is Paul necessarily an outlier. The Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca writes about his, quote, little deaths, the respiratory episodes with which he lives, sometimes gasping for air at hours at a time, contemplating whether or not this final hour has come. Or the number of votive offerings that we have from ancient healing temples, of people bringing an offering to the gods in order to receive what they view as a bodily transformation or a healing. Are not each of these potentially autobiographical testimonies of disability and impairment? Diagnosing disability in the past using contemporary medical taxonomies, I think, is impossible. But recognizing disability in the past outside of those categories, I think, is potentially more accessible than many historians have been led to believe. And in my experience, it's quite frequently the fear of anachronism, the fear of reading something into the past that's not actually there, which is shared, which stops a lot of scholars in my field from pursuing this task. And the great benefit of engaging with disability studies and disability theology, as I think my book shows, is rather than imposing frameworks onto the past, it helps us interrogate anachronistic frameworks that are well established already in our scholarly methods, particularly towards embodiment, but especially towards the projection of medical taxonomies and modern scientific knowledge of our bodies. It's quite easy to universalize our own bodily experiences. You have a body, and I have a body. What more needs to be said? But this tacit experience of embodiment affects the way that we as interpreters encounter ancient materials involving human persons. And until we interrogate those tacit assumptions with tools like disabilities or some disability studies or something else, our work will be and will remain in part anachronistic. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your attention.
We want to open it up for some questions for Isaac. Okay, here we have one.
Isaac, Bill Gaventa here. Thanks very much for that. I heard you last fall at RSBL. It strikes me there's a parallel at what you've done with Paul about people assuming that he was a, quote, normal person that maybe acquired some disabilities to what Jeremy Skipper did when his discussion about the suffering servant in Isaiah, where the assumptions of biblical scholars have always been that the suffering servant must have been some strong, heroic figure who then ended up being maimed or sick or whatever kind of thing that made him into that figure of scorn. Have you played around with that at all?
No, thank you for this, Bill. That's a great parallel. I haven't played with that specifically, and I do appreciate. Though I'm aware of Skipper's great work on the suffering servant. I think the reason why this comes up is because, like the suffering servant, these figures kind of take on personas or legacies that go beyond their bodies, and so the ideals and expectations that are placed upon them become almost inhuman. They're superhuman, right? But when you ground these figures actually in actual human embodied experience, then I think you begin to regain what gets lost when these figures are kind of made more abstract.
Yeah. And I just wanted to share with you, maybe you know about this already, but I don't know if the article is out yet, but I had the pleasure this summer of hearing Jen Strawbridge do a paper at a conference on the Council of Nicaea, in which she postulated that of the 200 plus leaders who were there, many of whom were called, there was a name for them. I forget what it was. There was some kind of title that meant they were people who had probably been persecuted as Christians, that the odds were that 80 to 90% of those people had some form of disability or acquired disability or something, and which I thought was just fascinating to think about a larger than 50% of people who were leaders in those days and ended up doing something like the Council of Nicaea.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. I did not know about that article, but that sounds fantastic. And I think it really is, I mean, because our sources are often, or at least the perception of our sources, especially ancient Christian sources, are that they're written by able-bodied people, it masks the reality of that that disability is actually a very common experience for ancient Christians, not least those who may have experienced any kinds of physical persecution or violence for their religion. Thanks for that, Bill.
Hi, Isaac. Your work there really resonated with me hello. In regards to it's got a bit of parallel with Christos Tsiolkas's book Damascus, which queers Paul. It's a fictional account. But the other point that I wanted to make was you actually answered one of my questions, was who drew the cover of your book? Because I was trying to find the artist. And so thanks for your self-artistry. The question that I have here is, you mentioned that thinking about Jesus' body misbehaving, Could you comment on the possibility of Christ pre-cross potentially exhibiting any disabilities from an exegetical perspective and potentially from a theological perspective as well?
Yes, thank you for this question. I have written on Jesus in Luke 19. So the Luke 19 talks about Jesus's encounter with Zacchaeus, and often that text is read as being about it describes him as a short person. And that's often an attribute of Zacchaeus, but I argue exegetically that is actually quite ambiguous, that it can actually be either Zacchaeus or Jesus, and it really depends on the predisposition of the interpreter. So I think that's one area, that's a gray area. I don't think it's a slam dunk, but it is a gray area where I think you could say maybe Jesus has short stature, maybe he's shorter. But also in Luke's gospel, it does describe him as being circumcised, right? So in Luke 2, his parents bring him up to Jerusalem to, he's circumcised, and there's purification, things like that. And so in a Jewish context, of course, circumcision is not a disability. It's an enablement. In fact, having foreskin in a Jewish context is disabling in some Jewish contexts. But from a Greco-Roman perspective, Luke's writing in Greek. He's writing kind of biography, historiography to his wider audience. And having that detail about Jesus, it's very quotidian. But from a Greek and Roman perspective, that's one of the few bodily details we receive about Jesus in all of the Gospels, at least the canonical Gospels. So I think those are the two kind of areas that might point to places where there might be bodily differences, bodily disabilities. Your question, I love this question. Your question is very specifically pre-cross. Post-cross, of course, Jesus's body misbehaves all the time. In Luke 24, the road to Emmaus, right? Is it that the disciples there don't recognize it because of a condition that they have, or is it that Jesus's body transforms? And this actually becomes a motif in early Christian literature, in the Acts of John, in various different accounts, where Jesus' body, he shapeshifts. He turns into a boy, he turns into a man, he prevents people from looking at him. So in this way, Jesus' body, it's unstable after the cross, and in a resurrected or higher body state. And that might tell us a little bit about the kinds of ideals and expectations they have for Jesus's body, at least among some of the literary communities that produce these texts. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, Isaac. We have a question online from Addie. They ask, disability in the ancient Mediterranean world was understood differently than today. Applying contemporary frameworks retrospectively risks imposing meanings Paul and his contemporaries would not have recognized. So they ask, how do you navigate this tension?
Thanks, Addie, for this wonderful question. I spent a year of my life trying to answer this question. And so what I've come to is that while it's absolutely true, if I tried to describe the sociocultural model or the medical model to Paul, they would not understand it. At the same time, even though something's not intelligible to them, we're still able to, in my perspective, I think arguably, we're still able to see the dynamics of disability at work, even if it's not intelligible to them. So I'm not saying that my framework would be intelligible to Paul. It's definitely my interpretation of the kind of historical data we have. But in the same way, we can think, or at least from my perspective, from a historical perspective, I can look back and think about disability, or I can think about ethnicity, or I can think about queerness in the past. Those frameworks and the language and the concepts, of course, would not be wholly intelligible to the people in the historical periods in which they work. We share different ideas. But the dynamics, because I'm looking at it from a social and a cultural point of view, where we're looking at how ideals are interacting with other cultural processes and social actions, then from a sociological point of view, I can say that this is what's happening. But you're absolutely right that I'm not trying to impose these onto the past, but trying to recognize that this is a way of explaining what's happened in the past. Thank you for that. That's a wonderful question.
Hi, Jalissa Snyder here. Thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciate it. Something that struck me was when you were talking about Paul and demon and the scripture in 2 Corinthians. You argued that there was kind of like two spirits, like the Holy Spirit and the demon. What I was wondering though was, what if God sent the demon? Because it said that the messenger of Satan was sent. But it doesn't really say who.
Yes.
And I don't really have, I guess, didn't have time to really look up to see if it said who sent it. But I was just wondering if you could comment more on that, and maybe if it was God who sent it.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm one of the controversial people who think that it is God who sent it. In the Greek, it's a passive verb, so it was given to me. So we don't know the full sender, but we do get a sense of Paul going to God to try and remove it. So even if God doesn't send it, if we can't prove it from the text, he still consents to it still remaining there. And so when Paul prays for 3 times for his body to be quote unquote healed, God doesn't do anything. Actually, he keeps it there. I do think, I mean, and this makes theological problems for theologians, not for me as a historian. But the problem that I think, if God doesn't send it, then that actually creates a larger theological problem for Paul's conception of God, because it's not like in the 2nd or 3rd centuries when there's a clearly more defined, like Satan as a kind of power with demonic forces that are competing against God. In ancient Jewish conceptions of God, God has to be sovereign over everyone, even over spiritual forces, right? If there are tricksters, there are wily agents, but I mean, even when we get to Job, the Satan there, the accuser, still has to ask permission to act against God's agents. So I think it makes a little bit more sense for it to be God, the one who sends this in the first place, and that also makes sense for why it's able to coexist with the Holy Spirit inside of Paul's body.
Thank you. This is Ben Bond speaking in the back here, actually.
Again.
I thank you for your talk. I was reflecting, I was very privileged to be able to take a race in the New Testament course with Dr. Yi-Jan Lin at Yale Divinity School, who I think is early Christian. I know is an early Christian scholar. I think you would probably have a really great conversation with her. Definitely recommend connecting. But in her work, a lot of the focus was the consideration of the construction of like racial like identity and race, which is not something that really kind of came about until the colonial era. And it had its like, proto manifestations prior to that as well. But I thought it was like the fact that you talk about the distinction of Paul's different ethnic distinctions being related to circumcision and the possibility of a perception of disability connected to that. I was curious if you had thought about the intersection of race and disability and its construction in that particular context within Paul's writings and like New Testament stuff more broadly.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, for this. I really do appreciate it. I have thought a little bit about this, and in the book, I do talk about how a little bit about how the circumcision in particular becomes, we could say, racialized and othering. It's a condition. It's a characteristic of other people. I don't think of it, and I think this is the next step for someone else if they're wanting to do more further research, but I don't think of it too deeply in terms of Paul and ethnicity. I mean, there are large debates right now, Paul within Judaism. They're just debates about how Paul thinks about his own ethnicity. So I'm not sure how we get to how Paul is characterizing other ethnicities. until we're able to kind of, with confidence and stability, define his own sense of his own Judaism. But I do think that there is an intersection there, because ethnicities and ethnic physical characteristics, sometimes in physiognomic literature or stigmatized literature, become associated with disabilities. There is an overlap there. So there is an intersection between those two things. And I do think that's an important area for future research. Thanks, Ben, for that great question.
Hi, Isaac. I'm Devin Stahl from Baylor University. Thank you
Dev.
for your presentation. It was really wonderful. I'm wondering, so it makes sense to me to use a sociocultural model of disability when doing this work, and it seems like a lot of other biblical scholars will use that as well. But you hinted at the beginning it might be different if you used crip theory, and I would love to hear you riff just a little bit on how the book would have been different if you had used crip theory as a model rather than the cultural model of disability.
Yes, thanks, Devin, for this. I can only speak to it, I think, in broad strokes. One of the things I think is interesting about some of the crip work that I've read in crip theory is, of course, the overlap with queer studies and trying to think about the intersection between queerness and disability. But then I also think there's a sense of self-reflection, a meta reflection upon the field and the way disability theory has kind of developed, and in some ways developed apart from discussions about queer theory and queer theology. So I think if it did encompass more crip theory, it would involve a lot more meta criticism, a little bit more, I think. How do I phrase this? I don't want to overgeneralize. I think the crip theory that I've engaged with a lot more recently and read, I'm thinking of J. Logan Smilgis's work, is a little bit less, it's a little bit less optimistic and a little bit more pessimistic about some of the methods and modes and approaches to disability, especially disability in the past. And so I think that would have enriched the project a little bit more, maybe allowing me to be a little bit more critical about how Paul uses and deploys and maybe reinforces disability in his letters. Yeah, so I think that's the best that I can answer at this point, but I'm happy to carry. If you have any ideas, I would love to hear them, because I think that that's something that I'd really like to engage with in biblical scholarship. I mean, it's something we're trying to push for in our Disability and Healthcare in the Ancient World unit with the Society of Biblical Literature. We put out a call specifically for a session this year on engaging biblical texts with crip theory and crip theology, and there were no submissions. And so we're just really, it's a desideratum to really put this on the radar of the wider guild, that this is an important frontier that's been going on for the last many decades, actually, but it really needs to bear impact, I think, on biblical scholarship.
All right. Thank you so much. Let us thank Dr. Soon.
Thanks, everyone.